In these woods, compasses spin and time slips sideways. Fires refuse to stay lit, and cameras die with full batteries. The forest doesn't feel haunted, it feels aware. Tracks appear overnight, too wide, too deep, and always circling back. Men have entered chasing legends and returned dragging silence behind them, unable to speak of what they saw. Something walks just beyond vision, heavy enough to shake branches, smart enough to avoid every trap. It doesn't roar, it doesn't run, it waits. And when it moves, the wilderness holds its breath. Clallam Bay, Washington, 2016. Rain Shadow National Preserve. The remote forests of Rain Shadow National Preserve had always been a draw for those seeking solitude among ancient trees and misty mountains. Sandra McCulley, a 328-pound retired elementary school teacher from Spokane, had been no exception when she booked a week-long retreat in a rustic hunting cabin nestled deep within the park's dense woodland. The area was known not only for its breathtaking natural beauty, but also for whispered stories among locals of strange sightings and unexplained noises that had persisted for generations. Sandra had come to the wilderness seeking healing and peace after finalizing a bitter divorce 6 months earlier. At 58, she had recently begun a weight loss journey and thought the solitary retreat would provide both mental clarity and physical challenge with daily nature walks. The cabin she had rented was deliberately primitive. No electricity, just propane lamps and a wood stove, perfect for disconnecting from modern distractions. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. Sandra had spent her time hiking nearby trails, photographing wildflowers, and reading books she had brought along. She had written in her journal about feeling truly at peace for the first time in years. The cabin's isolation, nearly 7 miles from the nearest paved road, had given her exactly the seclusion she had craved. On the third night, everything changed. Sandra had gone to bed early, exhausted from a particularly long hike to a nearby ridge. According to her later account, she had been awakened just after midnight by what she initially thought was thunder, a heavy rhythmic pounding against the outer walls of the cabin. The sound had moved methodically around the perimeter, as if something massive was circling the structure. Thinking it must be a black bear, Sandra had grabbed her flashlight and cautiously approached the side window. What she had glimpsed through the glass had made her blood run cold. A massive, hairy, hunchbacked figure standing taller than the doorframe. Sandra later described seeing what appeared to be unmistakably human eyes, staring back at her from a face that was decidedly not human. Before she could even process what she was seeing, the creature had smashed its fist against the cabin wall with such force that the entire side began to collapse inward. Exposed wooden beams had splintered like twigs, and the window had shattered, sending glass fragments across the floor. Pure instinct had taken over. Sandra had fled through the front door, barefoot and wearing only her nightgown, into the pitch-black forest. She had no memory of grabbing anything, not her phone, emergency whistle, or even shoes. Later investigation revealed she had run nearly 2 miles through dense underbrush before falling into a rocky ravine. Sandra had no memory of what happened after the fall. Search and rescue teams, alerted by the cabin owner when Sandra failed to check in the next day, had found her the following afternoon, unconscious and suffering from mild hypothermia. Her nightgown had been torn, her feet bloodied from running barefoot through the forest, and strange, long, claw-like marks had scored the skin along her thighs. The medical report had documented a cracked rib, broken ankle, and numerous contusions consistent with a serious fall. The park rangers who had investigated the cabin had found the sidewall partially caved in, with what appeared to be massive handprints pressed into the wooden siding. The official report had attributed the damage to a large black bear, noting that the animal had likely been attracted by food scents. Sandra's account to authorities had been met with skepticism. Rangers had suggested that in her panic and darkness, she had misinterpreted a bear's appearance. They had pointed out that Rain Shadow National Preserve had no documented large primate species. The claw marks on her thighs had been attributed to sharp branches she had encountered while running through the forest. But Sandra had remained adamant about what she had seen. The eyes, she insisted, had looked at her with intelligence and intention, not the blank stare of a wild animal. The figure had stood completely upright, with shoulders broader than any human she had ever seen. After recovering physically, Sandra had never returned to the Rain Shadow Peninsula. She had moved to a suburban neighborhood outside of Portland, where she had started a blog documenting her experience and connecting with others who claimed similar encounters. Her description of the creature, over 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, with a pronounced brow and deeply set eyes, matched dozens of other accounts from the Pacific Northwest. The Park Service had maintained their explanation of a bear encounter, but 3 other hikers in the same region had reported similar sightings that summer. None had experienced the level of aggression that Sandra had described, but all had mentioned the distinctive eye contact that had left them shaken. Sandra had eventually lost over 100 pounds after her encounter, crediting her new fitness regimen to a desire to never be caught unable to run again. 5 years later, she still experienced nightmares about those human-like eyes staring at her through the glass. She remained convinced that what she had encountered that night was no bear, but something far more inexplicable that science had yet to acknowledge. Hrafnfjall Valley, Iceland, 1994. Fog-covered birch forest. The Hrafnfjall Valley had long been considered one of Iceland's most hauntingly beautiful regions, nestled between 3 glaciers and cloaked in mysterious fog for much of the year. The sprawling birchwoods and mossy terrain had drawn hikers and nature enthusiasts from around the world, but local Icelanders had always approached the valley with a measure of caution. Ancient tales of huldufolk, hidden people, and darker, more sinister creatures had persisted for centuries, passed down through generations who lived in the shadow of the valley. Kristján Einarsson, a 73-year-old widower and former park ranger, had known the valley better than most. After 40 years of service mapping trails and guiding visitors through the region, retirement had not diminished his love for the ancient woodlands. The silver-haired man had been a fixture in the small community near the valley entrance, recognized by his weathered face and the hand-carved walking stick he had fashioned from a lightning-struck birch. On October 7, 1994, Kristján had set out alone on what should have been a routine mushroom foraging expedition. The autumn season had been particularly bountiful that year, with chanterelles and porcini mushrooms flourishing in the damp undergrowth. Kristján had told his son, Arni, that he would return before nightfall. When darkness descended and his father had not returned, Arni had notified local authorities. The search had begun immediately, with a team of experienced rangers combing the misty forests through the night. Visibility had been severely limited by a thick fog that had rolled in from the glaciers, reducing flashlight beams to dim halos in the darkness. It had not been until the second day of searching that they had found Kristján's body, slumped against an ancient birch tree in a secluded clearing nearly 4 kilometers from his intended foraging area. The initial assessment by the search team had been that Kristján had suffered a heart attack or stroke while hiking. However, when they had attempted to move his body, the true extent of his injuries had become apparent. His ribcage had been crushed inward with such force that multiple ribs had splintered. Deep, mottled bruising had covered his arms and torso, with particularly severe trauma to his upper back and shoulders. Most disturbing had been the massive footprints discovered in the soft earth surrounding the tree, impressions nearly twice the size of a human foot, spaced at intervals that suggested a stride length impossible for any known local wildlife. The ground had been disturbed in a circular pattern around Kristján's body, as if something large had paced around him before departing into the deeper forest. The official investigation had progressed along predictable lines. Medical examiners had documented the extensive crushing injuries and had noted that the pattern of trauma had been inconsistent with a fall. The official cause of death had been listed as blunt force trauma consistent with wildlife encounter, possibly reindeer. Dagbjartur Magnusson, a local hunter who had been tracking a wounded fox in the area on the same day, had initially come forward with a disturbing account. He had claimed to have seen a dark, massive ape-like figure moving silently through the fog approximately 2 kilometers from where Kristján's body had been found. The creature had walked upright with an unusual rolling gait and had disappeared into the mist before Dagbjartur could process what he had witnessed. After being ridiculed by local police, Dagbjartur had recanted his statement and refused to discuss the matter further. Arni had rejected the official explanation from the beginning. His father had been an experienced outdoorsman who had known how to avoid startling wildlife. Moreover, reindeer were not known for aggressive behavior toward humans, particularly the type that would result in such catastrophic injuries. Arni had conducted his own investigation, interviewing older residents who had shared hushed stories of the Skuggamadr, the Shadow Man, a creature from the sagas said to stalk the valley during heavy fog. The local newspaper had run a brief obituary mentioning only that Kristján had died in a tragic accident while pursuing his love of nature. No mention had been made of the unusual footprints or the inconsistencies in the official report. When Arni had attempted to bring attention to these details, he had been gently but firmly advised by local officials to let the matter rest out of respect for his father's memory. In the decades since, the clearing where Kristján had been found had become something of an unofficial memorial. Younger hikers often left small tokens, polished stones, carved figures, or small bottles of Brennivin near the base of the birch tree. Few of them had known exactly why the tradition had started, but older locals had ensured the practice continued. Tour guides no longer took groups to that section of the forest, and rangers recommended tourists stay on marked trails. Local children had grown up hearing warnings about wandering alone in the fog, and while most had dismissed the tales of the Skugamater as superstition, they had nonetheless heeded the advice. Arnie, now an old man himself, still visited the clearing once each year on the anniversary of his father's death. He never went alone, and he never stayed after the fog began to rise. The Uluguru Mountains in eastern Tanzania had long been revered for their exceptional biodiversity and dense, mist-shrouded forests. Rising dramatically from the surrounding plains, the mountains formed part of the Eastern Arc Range, a region known for its unique flora and fauna found nowhere else on Earth. The local Luguru people had respected these mountains as sacred for centuries, with legends warning of spirits that guarded the deeper, more remote sections. Despite increasing ecotourism in the region, vast portions of the Uluguru Range remained largely unexplored by outsiders, known primarily to village elders and a handful of dedicated researchers. In June 2009, 5 university students from Nairobi had planned what they had intended to be an adventurous but straightforward research excursion into these mountains. Tasha Owino, a 22-year-old ornithology student, had organized the trip after receiving a small grant to document rare bird species endemic to the Eastern Arc forests. She had recruited 4 classmates to join her: Patrick Kimani, a photography major, Josephine Nyambura, a botany student, Caleb Otieno, studying environmental conservation, and Martin Kiprop, a zoology major specializing in primates. The group had selected a remote section of the mountains, approximately 27 kilometers from the nearest sizable settlement. They had obtained the necessary permits and had informed park authorities of their planned route and itinerary. Several local villagers had reportedly advised against camping in their chosen location, particularly an elderly man who had warned them about a creature the Luguru people called Mitu Mukubwa, the big man, said to inhabit the densest parts of the forest. The students, educated in modern scientific principles, had politely dismissed these warnings as folklore. Their first 2 days in the mountains had proceeded without incident. Tasha had documented several rare bird species, including the Uluguru bush shrike, while Josephine had collected plant samples for the university herbarium. The weather had been unusually cool for June, with thick morning mist lingering well into the afternoon. On the evening of the 3rd day, the atmosphere around their camp had changed noticeably according to the survivors' later accounts. As darkness had fallen, strange sounds had begun to emanate from the surrounding forest. Low, guttural growls interspersed with sharp knocking sounds, as if someone were striking wood against wood. Caleb, the most skeptical of the group, had insisted these were merely sounds from a troop of baboons known to inhabit the area. The others had been less certain, particularly after the noises had formed a distinct pattern that had continued for nearly 2 hours before abruptly stopping. Around midnight, Martin had left the tent to relieve himself, telling his companions he would return shortly. When 15 minutes had passed without his return, Patrick had called out for him. There had been no response. After 30 minutes, all 4 remaining students had exited their tents with flashlights, calling Martin's name repeatedly. Their shouts had echoed through the dark forest without answer. The students had searched the immediate area until dawn, finding no trace of Martin except for his flashlight, discovered approximately 50 meters from camp with its lens shattered. With the first light of morning revealing no further clues, the group had made the decision to hike to the nearest ranger post, approximately 5 hours away by foot. 2 park rangers had returned with them to the campsite later that day. During a more extensive search, they had discovered Martin's torn t-shirt hanging from a branch nearly 3 meters above the ground. Nearby, pressed into a patch of soft mud, they had found what appeared to be an enormous handprint, much larger than any human hand, with impressions suggesting opposable thumbs. The rangers had photographed this evidence, but had officially attributed it to a distorted impression from a fallen branch or animal tracks overlapping in the mud. The search for Martin had continued for another day without success. On the morning they had planned to hike out and request additional help, Caleb had separated from the group to collect water from a nearby stream. When he had not returned after 40 minutes, Patrick had gone looking for him. All he had found had been Caleb's water bottle beside the stream, the surrounding vegetation crushed as if something large had moved through it recently. Authorities had launched a full-scale search operation involving police, additional park rangers, and local volunteers. Despite exhaustive efforts covering several square kilometers, Neither Martin nor Caleb had been found. 5 days after the initial disappearance, the search had been officially downgraded. Tasha, Patrick, and Josephine had been escorted back to civilization by a heavily armed team of rangers. All three had been treated for shock and minor injuries sustained during their ordeal. The official report had concluded that the missing students had likely been attacked by leopards, which were known to inhabit the mountains, or had fallen into one of the many ravines that cut through the terrain. The survivors had told a different story. Josephine had insisted that on the night before Caleb's disappearance, she had glimpsed a massive figure crouching in the trees watching their camp, something far larger than any known primate species, with eyes that had reflected their campfire like glowing coals. Tasha had described finding strange, twisted branches arranged in unnatural formations around their campsite on the final morning. The three survivors had all dropped out of university within months of the incident, citing post-traumatic stress. Tasha had eventually recovered sufficiently to complete her degree at a different institution, but she had abandoned her planned career in field research. In occasional guest lectures at East African universities, she had cautiously shared her experience as a warning about wilderness safety, always concluding with the same advice: "There are things even the locals won't talk about directly, and whatever we heard that night, they weren't baboons." The Uluguru Mountains remained open to hikers and researchers, but local guides now refused to camp in certain areas, including the site where the students had pitched their tents in 2009. When asked why, they typically offered practical reasons: poor water access or uncomfortable terrain, but they never took groups there, especially not after sunset. The winter of 1978 had been particularly harsh in the Canadian Rockies, with record snowfall blanketing the pristine wilderness of Glacier Crown Wilderness Reserve. Established in the late 1800s as one of Canada's earliest protected preserves, Glacier Crown spanned over 6,000 square kilometers of majestic mountains, glaciers, ice fields, and dense alpine forests. While thousands of tourists visited each summer, winter transformed the landscape into a remote and demanding backcountry terrain that attracted only the most seasoned outdoor adventurers. The isolated forested passes near Mount Cairnloch had long been favored by expert skiers seeking pristine powder away from marked trails, though local indigenous legends warned of dangerous spirits that roamed these secluded areas during the coldest months. Brothers Daniel and Greg Masters, aged 28 and 31 respectively, had been born and raised in Calgary and had spent their entire lives exploring the Canadian Rockies. Both were certified wilderness first responders and had completed advanced avalanche safety training. Their childhood friend, Ricky Parnell, 29, though slightly less experienced, had still accumulated over a decade of backcountry skiing experience. The trio had been planning their 3-day expedition near Mount Cairnloch for months, intending to dig a snow cave and camp overnight in a secluded alpine pass known for its spectacular views and untouched powder. On January 17, 1978, they had set out from the trailhead parking lot with full winter gear, emergency supplies, and a detailed route plan filed with preserve authorities. Weather conditions had been favorable, with clear skies and temperatures around -15 degrees Celsius. According to the trip plan they had submitted, they had intended to ski approximately 9 kilometers into the backcountry before establishing their snow cave camp. 3 days later, when the men failed to return as scheduled, preserve wardens had initiated standard missing persons protocols. Just hours into the search, a ranger had discovered Ricky staggering along the main access road, 7 kilometers from where their vehicle had been parked. He had been barefoot despite the -23 degrees Celsius temperature, his socks and boots mysteriously absent. More disturbing had been his mental state, disoriented, hyperventilating, and repeatedly muttering about a hairy man with no face that had smelled like wet dog and death. Ricky had been immediately transported to Crown Valley Medical Outpost for treatment of severe hypothermia and frostbite. His medical examination had revealed multiple contusions across his back and shoulders, deep scratches on his calves, and unusual bruising around his neck, which the attending physician had noted resembled large fingertip impressions. Based on Ricky's fragmented information, search and rescue teams had located the trio's camp the following morning. The scene had been described in the official report as catastrophic. Their snow cave had been half collapsed, with equipment scattered over a 30-meter radius. Most perplexing had been the numerous large claw marks gouged into the snow and the clearly visible drag trails leading away from the campsite into the dense forest. Greg's body had been recovered approximately 250 meters from camp, partially buried in a snowbank. The official autopsy had documented massive trauma to his thoracic cavity, with his chest crushed inward with such force that multiple ribs had been completely shattered, puncturing both lungs. The medical examiner had noted that the pattern of injury had not been consistent with an avalanche or fall, more closely resembling compression trauma from an extreme force applied directly to the chest. Despite an exhaustive 2-week search involving helicopters, trained dogs, and dozens of experienced rescue personnel, Daniel's body had never been found. The search had uncovered only his torn backpack, one ski pole bent nearly in half, and most mysteriously, what several searchers had described as enormous barefoot prints, measuring approximately 45 centimeters in length, with a stride length of over 1.5 meters. Ricky's account of what had transpired had evolved considerably during his recovery. Initially, he had claimed they had heard strange howling sounds on their second night, unlike any wolf or coyote familiar to the experienced outdoorsman. Later, he had amended his statement to include that Greg had fired his emergency flare gun into the darkness after becoming convinced something was stalking their camp. In his third interview with authorities, Ricky had admitted they had discovered a frozen footprint bigger than a dinner plate earlier that day, which Greg had photographed with his camera. The official investigation had concluded that the group had likely been caught in a localized avalanche while sleeping, with Ricky somehow escaping the worst of it. His confused mental state and bizarre claims had been attributed to trauma and hypothermia-induced hallucinations. Greg's death had been officially ruled as accidental due to blunt force trauma consistent with avalanche injuries, while Daniel had been presumed dead from similar causes, his body likely buried under massive snowpack. Several inconsistencies had troubled investigators, however. No typical avalanche debris field had been present, and the weather stations had recorded no significant snowfall or temperature fluctuations that might have triggered a slide. The camera mentioned in Ricky's account had never been recovered, and most curiously, a section of forest downhill from the camp had shown evidence of multiple trees being snapped at heights of over 2.5 meters, unusual damage for any known natural phenomenon in the area. Though never charged with any wrongdoing, suspicion had followed Ricky. He had moved to Oregon later that year, legally changing his name and cutting ties with the Masters family. In 2005, a private investigator hired by Greg and Daniel's aging parents had tracked him down. When confronted about the incident, Ricky had reportedly become visibly distressed, refusing to elaborate on the events beyond a brief statement. "We weren't alone up there. We shouldn't have gone off trail. Some things in those mountains aren't in any guidebook." The pass where the incident had occurred had subsequently developed an unofficial nickname among conspiracy theorists and cryptozoology enthusiasts: Sasquatch Gulch. Preserve officials actively discouraged the use of this name and the associated rumors, emphasizing safety concerns about encouraging inexperienced hikers to seek out remote and dangerous locations based on folklore. 20 years after the incident, a memorial plaque for the Masters brothers had been placed at the trailhead closest to their last campsite. Glacier Crown now required all backcountry winter campers to carry satellite communication devices, a policy change partially influenced by the 1978 tragedy. Vosges Mountains, northeastern France, 1985. The Vosges Mountains of northeastern France had long been regarded as a place of mystery and natural beauty. Stretching along the western edge of the Rhine Valley, these ancient mountains were characterized by rounded summits, dense forests of pine and fir, and deep secluded valleys. The region had a rich cultural history, with Celtic and Germanic influences blending over centuries to create unique folklore about forest spirits and supernatural guardians. Local hunters had passed down tales of strange encounters for generations, though most modern residents dismissed them as simple superstitions designed to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. In December 1985, an unusually powerful winter storm had descended upon the region, blanketing the mountains in nearly a meter of fresh snow. The harsh weather had deterred most visitors, leaving the wilderness virtually empty except for wildlife and the occasional local hunter seeking deer. The remote hunting zones near the Lac Noir had become particularly isolated, accessible only by snowshoe or ski, with the nearest village over 10 kilometers away. Jean-Pierre Lemoine, a 54-year-old deer hunter from Strasbourg, had been undeterred by the forecast. A lifelong outdoorsman and retired forestry worker, Jean-Pierre had known the Vosges Mountains intimately, having hunted there for over 3 decades. According to his wife, Elise, he had been particularly determined to make this winter trip, mentioning something about unusual tracks he had spotted during his previous outing 2 weeks earlier. On December 13th, Jean-Pierre had driven to a small hunter's lodge near the base of the mountains, planning a 3-day solo excursion in the forest. He had packed his Remington rifle, a high-quality film camera, and enough supplies to comfortably weather the storm in the small wooden shelter he maintained deep in the hunting zone. When Jean-Pierre had failed to return home on December 16th as planned, Elise had contacted local authorities. The search for Jean-Pierre had been complicated by the continuing snowfall and poor visibility. 5 days after his disappearance, a search team had finally located his body in a small clearing approximately 2 kilometers from his shelter. The scene had immediately struck the rescuers as unusual. Jean-Pierre's rifle had been found nearby. The wooden stock snapped completely in half as if broken by enormous force. His camera had been recovered intact but contained no film, though his journal indicated he had brought 3 rolls with him. Most disturbing had been Jean-Pierre's condition. Despite the freezing temperatures that should have preserved his body, his face had been frozen in an expression that the first responders had described as pure terror. His thick winter clothing had been torn in several places, and deep puncture wounds had marked his torso and abdomen. The official medical examiner had noted that the wounds appeared to have been made by something with considerable strength, as several had penetrated through multiple layers of clothing, including his heavy leather hunting jacket. The initial investigation had focused on animal attack theories. Local wildlife officials had suggested that Jean-Pierre had likely been mauled by wild boars after falling and injuring himself. Boars were common in the region and could become aggressive if cornered or threatened. This explanation had seemingly been supported by several broken branches and disturbed snow around the scene. However, certain details had troubled investigators. No boar tracks had been found near the body, only what the official report had described as unusually large barefoot-like impressions that had formed a clear circle around the victim. Furthermore, Jean-Pierre's hunting knife had been found unsheathed several meters away, with what appeared to be dark hair or fur stuck to the blade. Samples that laboratory testing had later found inconclusive, being similar to primate hair but not matching any known European species. The authorities had ultimately settled on the wild boar theory despite these inconsistencies. Jean-Pierre's death had been classified as an unfortunate hunting accident, with the official cause listed as exsanguination due to animal attack combined with hypothermia. The case had been closed within weeks, generating only a small article in the regional newspaper. What had not been widely reported were the statements from Jean-Pierre's hunting companions. According to Marcel Dubois, Jean-Pierre had confided in their hunting group about an encounter during his previous trip to the mountains. He had described seeing what he called un homme singe, a man-ape, moving with incredible speed between the trees, a figure too tall, too hairy, and too agile to be human. Most had laughed off his account, assuming Jean-Pierre had glimpsed a deer or bear in poor visibility conditions. Only his closest friend, Pierre Duchamp, a local gamekeeper, had taken him seriously. Years later, in 2003, Pierre had shared a similar story with his grandson. According to family members, he had admitted to once seeing the creature himself, like a walking gorilla with dead eyes, while checking hunting permits in a remote section of the forest. Pierre had claimed that such sightings had been known to the older forest workers for generations, but were never discussed openly for fear of ridicule, or worse, attracting thrill seekers who might disturb whatever creature inhabited the deeper woods. The story had remained largely forgotten until a 2008 cryptozoology blog had revisited the case, connecting Jean-Pierre's death to similar incidents across Europe's mountainous regions. The blog had noted peculiar similarities: broken hunting equipment, puncture wounds inconsistent with known predators, and large, unidentifiable footprints at the scene. The author had speculated about a potential European variant of the North American Sasquatch, adapted to the mountainous regions stretching from the Pyrenees through the Alps into the Carpathians. Official forestry departments and wildlife agencies had consistently dismissed such theories. The Vosges Mountains had been thoroughly surveyed, they pointed out, with every species cataloged and monitored. No large, unknown primate could possibly remain undetected in Western Europe's heavily trafficked mountain ranges. Nevertheless, hikers in certain areas of the Vosges still reported unusual phenomena: powerful knocking sounds echoing through otherwise silent forests, inexplicable feelings of being watched, and occasionally, glimpses of something large moving just beyond the tree line. Local guides casually advised visitors against camping in particular valleys, especially during winter months when the forest fell silent under snow, and long nights provided cover for whatever might roam the ancient woods. Acre, Brazil, 2021. The northwestern Brazilian state of Acre had long been considered one of the Amazon's final frontiers. Bordering both Peru and Bolivia, its dense rainforests contain some of the most biodiverse and least explored regions in South America. The area near the Peruvian border was particularly remote, accessible primarily by boat along the winding tributaries of the Amazon River. Indigenous communities had inhabited these forests for millennia, with legends speaking of various forest guardians and spirits, including the Mapinguari, described in folklore as a large, powerful creature with an unbearable odor and an appetite for human flesh. In July 2021, 16-year-old Luana Ferreira had accompanied her uncle, Hugo Ferreira, on what was supposed to be an educational adventure into this pristine wilderness. Hugo, a respected field researcher for a Rio-based conservation organization, had been conducting a 3-week biodiversity assessment along the headwaters of the Rio Purus. The project had focused on documenting the effects of climate change on amphibian populations in isolated forest patches. Luana, a bright high school student on term break with aspirations of studying biology, had begged to join the expedition as a research assistant. Hugo had initially hesitated, concerned about the remote nature of their fieldwork site, over 8 hours by boat from the nearest town with a medical facility. However, Luana's enthusiasm and her parents' eventual consent had convinced him that the educational value outweighed the risks. The first 9 days of their expedition had proceeded smoothly, with Luana proving herself a capable assistant, meticulously recording data and helping collect specimens along the riverbanks and adjacent forest trails. On the 10th day, the researchers had established a new camp approximately 4 kilometers inland from the river, in a small clearing surrounded by primary rainforest. According to Luana's later statements, nothing unusual had occurred until early evening, when they had been processing the day's specimens. A piercing shriek had echoed through the trees, a sound Hugo had initially attributed to a howler monkey, though he had noted it seemed off somehow, deeper and more sustained than typical primate vocalizations. Hugo had decided to investigate, telling Luana he would walk to a nearby stream bank, where they had earlier spotted several interesting frog species. He had instructed her to continue cataloging their samples and promised to return before darkness fell completely. When Hugo had not reappeared after an hour, Luana had become concerned and had tried reaching him on their two-way radio. There had been no response. With twilight fading rapidly, Luana had faced a difficult decision. Following strict wilderness safety protocols, she had known she should remain at camp rather than risk becoming lost in the darkening forest. She had fired their emergency flare and had continued attempting radio contact until well past midnight, with no success. According to her subsequent account, approximately 2 hours after darkness had fallen completely, Luana had begun hearing heavy movement in the forest surrounding their camp. Something large had been circling their perimeter, occasionally breaking branches, but making surprisingly little noise for its apparent size. When she had directed her flashlight toward the sounds, she had glimpsed what she later described as a massive bipedal figure, covered in thick black hair, moving with a fluid gait despite its considerable bulk. Terrified, Luana had climbed the nearest sturdy tree, taking only the radio, flashlight, and a small emergency pack. From her elevated position approximately 6 meters above the ground, she had watched as the creature had entered their camp, methodically investigating their equipment and tearing open their supply bags. Most disturbing had been its apparent intelligence. It had examined their cameras with what seemed like purposeful curiosity before crushing one in its massive hand. Luana had remained in the tree for the entire night and following day, too frightened to descend even after the creature had disappeared at dawn. She had reported watching it return briefly around dusk, sniffing the base of her tree before moving off into the gathering darkness. Only after a second full night had passed with no further sightings had she finally climbed down, severely dehydrated and exhausted. Gathering what supplies remained, Luana had navigated back to the river using her uncle's compass and their expedition maps. The journey had taken nearly 14 hours through dense undergrowth. Upon reaching the riverbank, she had been fortunate to encounter a local fishing boat whose operator had transported her to the nearest settlement with radio communication. A search and rescue team had been assembled immediately, reaching the campsite approximately 36 hours after Luana's return to civilization. They had found the camp in disarray, with equipment scattered and supplies torn apart. Most concerning had been the long, deep scratch marks on several trees surrounding the site, marks that reached nearly 3 meters up the trunks. Despite an extensive search covering several square kilometers, Hugo had never been found. Only his torn field journal and one boot had been recovered, the latter discovered nearly half a kilometer from camp. Luana had been treated at a regional hospital for dehydration, exhaustion, and numerous lacerations across her calves and back that doctors had attributed to thorns and sharp branches encountered during her escape through the forest. The medical report had also noted unusual bruising along her shoulders and upper arms, with distinct patterns that one doctor had unofficially described as resembling massive finger impressions. The official investigation had concluded that Hugo had likely fallen into the river and drowned while collecting specimens. As for the camp's destruction and Luana's account, authorities had suggested a jaguar had been responsible. The Regional Environmental Protection Agency had issued a statement noting that jaguars occasionally investigated human camps when attracted by food scents. This explanation had failed to account for several aspects of Luana's experience, particularly her description of a bipedal creature with opposable thumbs capable of examining equipment. When pressed by journalists, officials had suggested that trauma and dehydration had caused the teenager to misinterpret normal wildlife behavior, possibly combining actual events with folklore she had heard from local guides. In the months following her rescue, Luana had created a detailed drawing of what she had seen: a hulking, ape-like creature standing over 2 meters tall, with disproportionately long arms that reached nearly to its knees. The drawing had briefly circulated on social media before mainstream scientists had dismissed it as fantasy, influenced by popular cryptid legends. Luana's family had relocated to Sao Paulo by the end of 2021, partly to escape media attention and partly to help their daughter recover from the psychological impact of the experience. She had eventually enrolled in a new school, but had abandoned her plans to study biology. According to friends, she suffered from recurrent nightmares about her time in the tree, particularly the memory of the creature sniffing below her hiding place, its breath visible in the moonlight as it had searched for her scent. The area where Hugo and Luana had established their camp was now informally avoided by local guides, though no official restrictions had been placed on the region. Indigenous communities nearby had expressed little surprise at the incident, with one elder simply stating that some parts of the forest had always belonged to the other people and always would.